ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም።
ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ
በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ይቻላል።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና
ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና ባገኘንባቸው የፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን እና የሆስተስ ስልጠናም በምዝገባ ላይ ነን።
ጥያቄና መልስ፣ የክፍል ስራዎች ብሎም ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁ አይነት
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ
በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ
አድራሻ ከ22 ማዞሪያ ወደ ሾላ ገበያ በሚወስደው መንገድ 150 ሜትር ገባ ብሎ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
Welcome to the fifth chapter, the second session. Today we are going to proceed from the yesterday's session. This is the continuation of the yesterday's session. And at the end of this session, you are expected to understand the behavior of inflation in Ethiopia. Today, I have brought you an empirical evidence for justifying the behavior of inflation in Ethiopia. Therefore, this session is just making you familiar about the behavior of the inflation in Ethiopia. That you are expected to integrate the theories with practices. I hope you know who reports inflation in Ethiopia, right? If you remember from yesterday's session, let me recall you that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is used for measuring the inflation. And this is the ratio of the cost of the basket of goods at period T divided by the cost of the basket to the base period, or at time not times 100, just for converting to percentage. I hope you know the responsibility, one of the responsibility of the Ethiopian Central Statistical Agency, right? I have brought you the case of Ethiopia that elaborates the level of inflation for March 2019. All these materials can be accessed at the CSCA website. You can check at www.csca.gov.et. You can find the regular inflation reports from this institution. Therefore, my source is the Central Statistical Agency, and this is the official report from there. CSA reports the inflation level for food components, non-food components, and the general or the aggregate inflation. This general consists of both the food and the non-food component, and this is referred as the general level of inflation. And the Central Statistical Agency reports the inflation into 3 categories. The first is it reports the annual average, the 12 months moving average inflation at a country level. The other is the inflation that is reported by comparing the current months with the same last year's month. And the purpose of this one is to observe the year-to-year change for that specific reported month. And the third report of inflation is based on the comparison of the current month with last month. For instance, now we are on September, right? Of course, September is not completed now because we are now on the 16th of September. For reporting the level of inflation for August, this one, the last one, makes a comparison with July. Therefore, the third report is a comparison of months on months inflation. You can also find the disaggregated inflation for regional states as well. You can find for Amhara, for Oromia, for Addis Ababa, Greda, for all regional states. However, at national level, the Central Statistical Agency aggregates the regional component of inflation just for having one national report. If you see the inception of this session, we have stated that the Central Statistical Agency reports both food and non-food level of inflation, as well as the aggregated one, or the general price that consists of both the food and non-food component. Here, the Central Statistical Agency, for forming the food inflation, it has some specific classes. Specifically for the food index, there are 10 classes. For example, there is a category or a class for bread and cereals, meat, fish and seafood, milk, cheese and eggs, oil, fruits, vegetables, and non-alcoholic beverages. These are brought for giving you the component of the food index classes. ስለዚህ የፉድ ኢንፍሌሽንን ሲሰራ 10 ክላሶች አሉ። already these are the 8 reported here. ስለዚህ በፉድ ኢንዴክሱ ሲሰራ የስጋ እና የስጋ ተዋጽኦች፣ የአሳ፣ የወተት፣ ቺዝ፣ የእንቁላል፣ የዘይት፣ የፍራፍሬዎች non-alcoholic beverages consider ይደረጋሉ ማለት ነው። Therefore, these forms the food inflation component. The other is the non-food index, and the non-food index is composed of 11 major divisions. The non-food consists of cigarettes, for instance, clothes, footwear, house rent, construction materials, furniture, transport cost, communication, recreation, education, restaurant. All these are the component of non-food index, and generally it has 11 major divisions. there are specific example. For instance, food component ሲባል ምን አይነት ነገሮችን ይወስዳል ነው። ጠቅለል ያለ ነገር አይደለም። በስሩ ብዙ ሳብ ኮምፖነንትስ አሉት ማለት ነው። ለምሳሌ ሴሪያል በተመለከተ የስፔሲፊክ ክሮፖች ይወሰዳል። የጤፍ ዋጋ፣ የራይስ፣ የሩዝ፣ የዊት፣ የስንዴ፣ የቬጂቴብልስ ኤንድ ፍሩትስ፣ የሙዝ፣ የብርቱካን all specific vegetables will be considered. even የስጋ፣ የወተት፣ የቺዝ፣ የእንቁላል፣ የቅቤ። ስለዚህ እነዚህ ኮምፖነንቶች የአማካይ የምግቡ ዘርፍ ኢንፍሌሽን ምን ይመስላል የሚለውን ለማየት የሚጠቅሙ ናቸው ማለት ነው። therefore the central CSA reports the food component inflation. In the same fashion, there are reports for the non-food component. For the non-food component, what are the specific items or examples that the Central Statistical Agency considers? In narcotics and stimulants, in ጫትን for instance, የጫት ዋጋ፣ የልብስ ዋጋ፣ የጫማ ዋጋ፣ የቤት ክራይ ዋጋ፣ የቤት መጠገኛ ወይም ሃውሲንግ ሪፔር፣ የኢነርጂ ለምሳሌ የማገዶ እንጨት፣ የክሰል፣ የሃውስሆልድ ፈርኒሽንግስ specifically there are sub components as well. የጤና፣ የትራንስፖርት፣ therefore this forms some of the examples of the non-food component. ስለዚህ non-food component specifically የሚወሰዱ አይተሞች አሉ ማለት ነው። አይተሞች አሉ። ሁለቱን ፉድ እና ነን ፉድ ኮምፖነንትን አንድ ላይ ስናደርግ ጀነራል ኢንፍሌሽን ሌቭል ሪፖርትን ይሰጠናል ማለት ነው CSA። ስለዚህ በየወሩ የሸቀጦች ዋጋ ይጠናል ማለት ነው። ገበያ ላይ ወጥተው ባለሙያዎች ሬጂስተር ያደርጋሉ። ለምሳሌ የአማካኝ በዚህ ወር የስጋ ዋጋ በኪሎ ስንት ነው? በተለያዩ ቦታዎች ላይ ይወስዳሉ። ለምሳሌ ወካይ የሆኑ ቦታዎች ላይ ማለት ነው። and they will take the average. And as I said you, CSA has 3 components of reports: food, non-food, and the general. And in time-wise, it reports the country level 12 months moving average inflation, meaning it ተንከባላይ ተንከባላይ ማለት ምንድነው? በየወሩ አማካይ እየተወሰደ ዘን አኑዋሉ ካፕቸር ይደረጋል ማለት ነው። Therefore, for instance, you see here the general inflation for 2009 ሐምሌ to ሰኔ 2010 ኮንሲደር የተደረገ ነው። ዋን ፊስካል ይር ማለት ነው። Here you see this is the actual statistical inflation report from the Central Statistical Agency homepage. And for instance here there is 12.6 for Megabit, right? For March. This means that the country's overall inflation rate for, that is annual, right? For March rises by 12.6% as compared to the previous similar period. The previous is to mean 2018. Here we are referring 2019, right? This is the 2019 report. 2019 report. Therefore, as compared to the last year, March, in this last year, March is just, since I am referring 2019, just consider 2019 as a current year, right? And 2018 as last year, just for the sake of simplifying the example. Therefore, based on this 12 months moving average, the 12 months, you see back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12 here. The inflation rate for March has risen by 12.6% as compared to the one which is observed in March 2018. In the same fashion, the disaggregated food inflation and non-food inflation for Magabit here is reported. For instance, the non-food inflation rate has increased by 30, all are positive, increased by 13.8% in 2019 as compared to the same months in 2018. It is considering the moving average. You can have an average يوصل annual. ስለዚህ ነን ፉድ ለምሳሌ አሁን መጋቢት 2011 ከመጋቢት 2012 አማካይ አኑዋሉ የተንከባለው ሲወሰድ በ2011 በ13.8% አድጓል። ከማን ጋር ሲነጻጸር ካለፈው አመት ተንከባላይ መጋቢት 2010 ላይ ማለት ነው። Therefore, this is the report. The other is the CSA also compares specific months inflation of the base year and the current year. Therefore, for instance, since we are taking the example of March, the general level of inflation for March in 2019 has increased by 11.1% as compared to the previous year, meaning here 11.1% has risen as compared to the March of 2010. This makes a comparison of the consumer price index of a specific month in the base year and in the current year. Base year means last year, and the current year means the one that we are now. ለምሳሌ እዚህም ጋር የፉድ ኢንፍሌሽን በ2011 መጋቢት ላይ 11.4 ይላል right. This means as compared to last year's March, this year's March inflation has increased by 11.4. ካለፈው ዓመት መጋቢት ወር ጋር ሲነጻጸር የዘንድሮ መጋቢት በ11.4% ብልጫ አለው ማለት ነው። Therefore, we can make a comparison of the consumer price index movements of the current and that of the last year or the previous years with reference to specific months. The other dimension now, the other time dimension report of the CSA is it compares the level of inflation of the consecutive months. For instance, መስከረምን ካለፈው ጋር ከነሐሴ ጋር ያወዳድራሉ። የነሐሴን ሲያወጡ ደግሞ ከሐምሌ ጋር ይወዳደራል። Therefore, this report is made by comparing the current months with the previous months. ማለት ካለፈው ወር አንፃር በዚህ ወር ምን አይነት የዋጋ ለውጥ አለ የሚለውን ለማየት ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ ሐምሌ ላይ ስንት ነበር? ነሐሴ ላይ ስንት ሆነ? ስለዚህ ኢንፍሌሽኑ ሪፈር የሚያደርገው ፐር መንዝ ያለውን ዲፈረንስ ነው ማለት ነው። መስከረም ላይ ያለው ሲሰራ ደግሞ ከባለፈው ከነሐሴ ወር ጋር ይነጻጸራል ማለት ነው። Therefore, we are comparing the consumer price index movement of the previous months with the current months. As a result, CSA report is disaggregated with the annual rolling inflation with comparison of the current specific months with the previous same month, and the third one is comparison of the current month with the previous month. Reports are disaggregated into three, and this time dimension of reports all consists of general inflation, food inflation, and the non-food inflation. That is how the CSA compiles and reports the inflation level in the country. Now, let's proceed to the empirical findings. What are the empirical evidences about the inflation in Ethiopia? What are the findings of research about the supply and demand determinants of inflation? What causes inflation in Ethiopia? And how can we empirically confirm the cause of inflation in Ethiopia? I have brought you two articles. The first article justifies the determinants of inflation in Ethiopia. And it has disaggregated into the supply side and the demand side of inflation in Ethiopia. And the model they use is ARDL, autoregressive distributed lag model. You will learn, I hope, if you have taken econometrics, you will learn what autoregressive distributed lag model is. There. ኢኮኖሜትሪክስ ስትማሩ በተለይም ታይም ሲሪስ ላይ የተለያዩ ሞዴሎች አሉ and commonly based on the behavior of the data the researchers determine the specific model that they employ for fitting their specific objectives. And here I have brought you the ARB, the autoregressive distributed lag model. The data type and the data source, the researchers had used annual data that runs from 1985 to 2016-17. That is a 32 years data. For time series, it is preferable to have at least 30 years data and beyond that. And they have collected a data that covers 32 years. And they collected the data from Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, from Ethiopian Economic Association, from National Bank of Ethiopia, and the Central Statistical Authority. አሁን ይሄ ታይም ሲሪስ ነው። ታይም ሲሪስ ሲሆን ደግሞ ሞዴሉ አኪዩሬትሊ ፊት እንዲያደርግ ሚኒመሙ 30 እና ከዛ በላይ እንዲሆን ነው የሚጠበቀው። ስለዚህ ዴታውን የወሰዱት ከተለያዩ ተቋማት ነው። ከሚኒስትሪ ኦፍ ፋይናንስ የሚባል ነበረው ድሮ፣ ከሱ ከናሽናል ባንክ፣ ኢትዮጵያን ኢኮኖሚክ አሶሲዬሽን ግሎባል የሆኑ አንዳንድ ዳታዎች አሉት። ሴንትራል ስታቲስቲካል አውቶሪቲም ኦፊሻል የሆኑ ሪፖርቶችን ከዛ ነው የወሰዱት። ስለዚህ ሪሰርች መስራት ስትፈልጉ በተለይ ታይም ሲሪስ የግድ ናሽናል ባንክን እና በተለይም ሲኤስኤን ኮንታክት ማድረግ ይኖርባቸዋል። because the authorized data for these inflation related data, anyways, generally macroeconomic variable data are accessed there. እና ለተማሪ ሲሆን በትብብር የትብብር ደብዳቤ ያጽፋችሁ መቀበል ትችላላችሁ። And the econometric model they specified has a foundation theory from the classical quantity theory of money. I hope you remember the theory of money, right? One is the classical quantity theory of money. And this theory argues that there is a direct as well as indirect relationship between inflation and money supply, considering inflation as a monetary phenomenon. Therefore, this empirical analysis is backed with the classical quantity theory of money. And I hope you remember the quantity theory of money, right? Their established equation is MV equals to PY, right? I hope. Where M is the nominal money supply, V is the velocity of money, meaning the speed or how many times a specific money revolves in the transaction in the economy. That is represented by V, velocity, the speed, or how many times the money is circulating from person A to person B to person C, just for purchasing goods and services. That is velocity, right? I hope you remember it, right? And the P is the general price level, and Y is the real output or the real GDP. As a result, their model is derived from the classical quantity theory, where MV equals to PY. Now, let me get you back here. It is talking about inflation, right? Determinants of inflation. Determinant of inflation. Inflation is a concern of price, right? Therefore, what they did is they net out or they simplify P, price, right? If you single out price, you could divide this by real output and this one by real output. Therefore, this is simple. Price equals to MV over Y. That is price. Now, just for converting to elasticity, meaning for making it convenient into percentage interpretation, we can put this into natural logarithm. Natural logarithm. ln. I hope you remember your mathematical economics or linear algebra. About the rule of natural logarithm. Anyways, put it into ln. ln እንዴት ኮንቨርት እንደሚሆን በግላችሁ አንብቡ. This is not the purpose of the course. And you can put this equation into ln, and it will be converted into ln of price equals to ln of m plus ln of v minus ln of the real output. real output ይሄ ከታች ያለው ኔጌቲቭ ሆኖ ወደ ላይ ይወጣል። ይሄ መልቲፕሊኬሽን ስለሆነ ፖዚቲቭ ይሆናል እዚህ ጋር ማለት ነው። therefore they converted it into ln. Here this ln p is telling you the change in price, and the price change, as mentioned previously, is measured using the consumer price index. That means it is possible to extend this classical quantity theory of money into this form, meaning you can substitute the ln of p, the change in price, with the consumer price index that measures inflation, right? Change in inflation. And converting this into standard equation, you can put beta naught. Beta naught is referring the constant term, and ln of the money M2 is broad money. If I think you remember in chapter 2, M2 is C plus D, right? Currency plus deposit, right? Therefore, the inflation is related with the money supply. The money supply considered here is the broader money. Plus, the other is these betas. All betas are coefficients. I think you have all taken from your econometrics course, right? And this is simple. And here BD is denoting for the budget deficit, and here RER is for the real effective exchange rate. Here WP is the world oil price, and here RGDP is the real domestic product. which is the same as this line of Y.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
Line of Y. Here you see that this theoretical foundation is telling you that for a price change, the money supply will have positive effect and the velocity as well have a positive effect, whereas the line of Y, here the real output is indicating you that it has a negative effect on the price here, on the price. Therefore, this is the theoretical hypothesis here. And here it is put as real GDP, right? Real GDP. Therefore, what we need now is you go to the National Bank and collect the money supply, the monetary, the budget deficit, for instance, the revenue and expenditure of the government. You make a difference for that. That is the budget deficit, and you can collect from the MOFID, National Planning Commission. ከነሱ ሪል ኢፌክቲቭ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬት ይሄን ከናሽናል ባንክ ነው የምታገኙት። ወርልድ ኦይል ፕራይስ አይ ቲንክ ይሄን ከኢኮኖሚክ አሶሲዬሽን ነው የወሰዱት። ሪል ጂዲፒም ከናሽናል ባንክም መውሰድ ይቻላል፣ ከፕላኒንግ ኮሚሽንም መውሰድ ይቻላል። ከሲኤስኤም አሁን ተናበው እየሰሩ ነው ያሉት። ስለዚህ እነዚህን ቫሪያብሎች ለመሰብሰብ ከተለያየ ተቋም መሄድ ይጠበቅባችኋል ማለት ነው። anyways you can extend this equation based on the theoretical foundation, meaning you first critically read what determines inflation. You read from literature and pick out the specific variables. Then you go and collect that specific data. And this model is estimated by EViews. EViews የሚባል ሶፍትዌር አለ፣ በዛ ነው የሰራው። Here this is the estimation. You see here the budget deficit is statistically significant. The money supply, the real effective exchange rate, and the world oil price. የዓለም ምንድን ነው የነዳጅ ዋጋ ሲቀያየር ያው እኛም ሀገር ላይ የኢንፍሌሽን ኢፌክት አለው። ስለዚህ ኢንፍሌሽን የገቨርንመንት ወጪ፣ የመኒ ሳፕላዩ፣ ኤክስቼንጅ ሬቱ እና የዓለም የነዳጅ ፕራይስ አፌክት ያደርገናል። That is the finding of the research. Therefore, the money supply, the budget deficit, the world oil price, and the real domestic product theoretically are considered to determine inflation. And here you see that this research tells you that this is more of we are interested in the money supply. The money supply is statistically significant. Of course, it is at 10%, right? Here you see the coefficient is positive, meaning higher money supply has a possibility of rising inflation. That is the mean that. Therefore, we can conclude that the increase in money supply can result in higher price or inflation, and this is consistent with the argument of the classical economists' quantity theory. And this researcher has also tried to show the monetary transmission channel, how, for instance, the money supply can result in the acceleration of inflation. When there is an increment in money supply, it says that it will have the possibility of accessing high amount of credit. This high amount of credit can be used for investment. This investment again will have a possibility of creating employment opportunities. And you know that investment is a component of aggregate demand, right? Aggregate demand is equal to investment plus consumption plus government purchase plus net export, right? Therefore, the boosting of the investment indirectly has a possibility of boosting the aggregate demand, and finally the economy will be experienced with high level of inflation. That is how they try to argue about the importance of money supply over important money supply to the inflation. The other case in point in Ethiopia, which is far better than the previous evidence, is this one. The previous study has been focusing only on the classical quantity theory, meaning they are focusing on some dimension of the theoretical foundation. However, this one is more comprehensive, which is reported by Jose and Vani. And one of the strengths of this report is that it has looked into long period of time from 75 to 2050. ከ1975 እስከ 2015 ያለ በጣም ረዘም ያለ አመታቶች ናቸው እነዚህ። and still ስለዚህ የተሻለ ወደ ሪያሊቲው የቀረበ ሪሰርች ነው ማለት ነው፣ empirical evidence ነው። and still this researcher has used the autoregressive lag distributed model, RDL, and one of the strengths of this paper as well is it tries to integrate both the monetarist and the structuralist views of inflation. Therefore, this is more of a complete one. It considers both the structure of the economy as well as the money dimension, the monetarist view. For justification, they have tried to put some preliminary reports they collected from the CSA. For instance, በሀገሪቱ ከፍተኛ ኢንፍሌሽን እንዳለ ማሳያዎችን አስቀምጠዋል። ለምሳሌ በምግብ በኩል ያለው ኢንፍሌሽን ሲታይ ከ2008 እና 2003 ሲያነጻጽሩ for instance, the food inflation has increased from 21.5 in 2003 to 35% in 2008. and even it has reached the peak in 2009 with a percentage of 44.2. And basically, their argument is the food inflation was abnormal at that time, and which as well is much higher than the non-food inflation. The non-food inflation that's mainly derived from the global food and oil price shocks. On the other hand, the non-food inflation rate before that of the 2008 was below 20%. However, in 2009, it has peaked to 24.6%. My interest is not on the specific figures or percentages, rather on the implication of these statistical reports. One of the implication is the food inflation rate in Ethiopia is higher than that of the non-food inflation. The question is why? This is because the economy is, as you know, predominantly agrarian. The general inflation level is following the trends of the food inflation. ማለትም አጠቃላይ የኢንፍሌሽኑ ሞር ኦፍ በፉድ ኢንፍሌሽን ነው ተጽዕኖ የሚደርስበት። ሞር ኦፍ the general inflation is influenced by that of the food inflation. As a result, what happens to food inflation determines the trade-off, the trends of the general inflation. ማለትም አጠቃላይ ያለው ኢንፍሌሽን ሞር በብዛት የሚገዛው ወይም ተጽዕኖ የሚያሳድረው ሞር ኦፍ ፉድ ኢንፍሌሽን ነው። ይሄም በጣም ረጅም ለረጅም ዓመታት ዳታ ወስደው ማሳያ አስቀምጠውለታል። ከ1975 እስከ 2015 how many years? Almost 4 years. የ40 ዓመት ዳታ ወስደው ማለት ነው። And I hope you see this food inflation, right? And ቀዩ ይሄ ላይን የሚያሳየው የፉድ ኢንፍሌሽን ነው እና ግራፉን ካያችሁት የጀነራል ኢንፍሌሽኑ የፉድ ኢንፍሌሽንን ተከትሎ ነው የሚሄደው። more of the trend of this general inflation is largely directed by the food inflation. Food inflation ያው አንዳንድ ቦታ ይሁን በጣም ይደራረባል። This means that the food inflation has stronger influence on the trend of the general inflation. The other implication from this study is the general inflation is also highly correlated with the growth rate of the money supply in the economy. Hence, in the context of Ethiopia, inflation is a result of both the monetary phenomena and the structural problems. For instance, a problem from the supply side, such as drought, for instance. However, the non-food inflation is largely influenced by the money supply. And it is less related with the less related with that of the food inflation. ስለዚህ በኢትዮጵያ በነን ፉድ የሆኑ ኢንፍሌሽን ላርጅሊ ኦከር የሚያደርገው በመኒ ሳፕላይ ኤክስፓንሽን ነው ሚል ነው የዚህ ሪሰርች ፋይንዲንግ። I hope it is clear, right? Therefore, money supply has higher impact on the creation of non-food inflation. You see this one? This one is the non-food inflation. Non-food inflation, right? And this one is the growth of money supply. Money supply, you see, when the money supply increases, in the same fashion, the non-food inflation increases. And relatively, you can see that the movement of the non-food inflation is oriented by or is being influenced by the growth of the money supply. The money supply. የመኒ ሳፕላይ ከፍ ሲል የኢንፍሌሽኑ በዛ ልክ ነን ፉድ የሆኑ አይተሞች ከፍ ይላል ማለት ነው። አይው ዝቅ ሲል ደግሞ እዚህ አካባቢ ዝቅ ብሏል። ስለዚህ ነን ፉድ የሆኑ አይተሞች ላይ በመኒ ሳፕላይ ከፍተኛ የሆነ ኢንፍሉዌንስ አለው። በኢንፍሌሽን በመፍጠር ረገድ ከፍተኛ የሆነ ተጽዕኖ አለው ማለት ነው በኢትዮጵያ ኬስ። The model they specified is the autogressive distributed lag model for inflation, and they put the monetarist and the structure component in their equation. You see this P is the observed inflation rate for a specific period T. And here you see alpha. This is a constant term or the intercept. And you see here xt minus 1. This is to mean a lag period of 1. These are xt denotes for vector of explanatory variables. The vector of independent variables, which determines the general price level here. And what are these variables? These variables includes እነዚህ variables ከየመጣሉ ሊትሬቸር ላይ ነው የምትለቅሟቸው። ቲዮሪ እና ሊትሬቸር ላይ money supply, real GDP, government expenditure, real interest rate. All these are considered as explanatory variables that determines the level of inflation. That is a model specification. Now what they did is they took the first difference of the previous equation, meaning this is the observed inflation rate, right? Therefore, they need to make the first difference for fitting their model. Therefore, this is a change in general price level, and they extended the equation by including more of the specific variables. ፈርስት ዲፈረንስ ነው የወሰዱት ማለት ነው። ሶፍትዌር ካላያችሁ እዚህ ጋር ትንሽ it might be difficult for you. And they try to include this UC theta, I hope. This theta. Just for establishing or for defining the long run equilibrium relationship between the variables which are involved there. And this one, you see this one is error correction and tells you how fast or the speed of adjustment of inflation towards its long run equilibrium. With this model specification, they make analysis for the long run. And they found that the inflation in Ethiopia is affected by money supply, government expenditure. You see lagged value. Have you taken econometrics? You are saying that no sound. Check yours. I hope the sound is okay, right? Therefore, the inflation is being determined by money supply, lagged value of government expenditure. Lagged ማለት ለምሳሌ 2000 አንዳንድ ፔሪዮድ ወደ ኋላ እየሄደ ማለት ነው። This is made for adjusting for achieving stationarity, for instance. Real interest rate and the lagged value of GDP. This is the final, the ARDL inflation model. The dependent variable is the log of the consumer price index. And you see, ሁሉም ቫሪያብሎች እዚህ ላይ ገቡ ይችላሉ። It depends on the model diagnostics. ብዙ ቴስቶችን አልፎ ነው ይሄንን ሞዴል ፊት የሚደረገው። You see, now let's consider the money supply, for instances. Log is made for making it convenient for the interpretation. If it is log, you can interpret in terms of percentage. For instance, you see this coefficient? That is log of money supply. It tells you that as the money supply increases by 1%, inflation will increase by 0.84%. And I hope you remember the classical, the quantity theory of money, right? Money supply can result in inflation, right? Therefore, this theory is, or this hypothesis is confirmed in the case of Ethiopia. In the case of Ethiopia, almost it is a one-to-one effect. Almost ወደ አንድ የተጠጋ ነው, right? The other is interest rate. That is real interest rate. What will happen if there is an increment in real interest rate? A 1% increment in real interest rate will result in 0.17% increment in the inflation rate. It has also considered the real GDP and the government expenditure. What will happen when GDP increases, real GDP particularly, and what will happen if the government expenditure expands. You see real GDP, right? Real GDP is negative here, right? This is meant higher real GDP results in decrement of the inflation, right? Why? real GDP ሲጨምር inflation ይቀንሳል ሚል ነው ይሄ finding. ለምን? This is because this is real, right? ስለዚህ real GDP ጨመረ ማለት more real goods ወደ ኢኮኖሚው ተጨምሯል ማለት ነው። ስለዚህ more goods, more real goods or higher real GDP ወደ or goods ወደ ኢኮኖሚ join ሲያደርግ inflation ይቀንሳል ማለት ነው. It results in the reduction of the inflation. That is how the coefficient is negative. Coefficient is negative. The long run estimation result. In the long run, inflation in Ethiopia, empirical evidence are showing that is negatively affected by government expenditure. Government expenditure. You see, it is negative, right? As more government invests, it will result in more production of goods and services. And this again can result in lowering the inflation rate. However, in the long run, the study has come up with a positive relationship with real GDP, money supply, and real interest rate. Real GDP is it positively. This is talking about the long run inflation in Ethiopia. Therefore, you see that the inflation in Ethiopia is being determined by both monetary and by the structural factors. Monetary meaning money supply no. Structural factors, the government expenditure, GDP, እነዚህ የመሳሰሉት ናቸው ማለት ነው. Therefore, the Ethiopian economy is influenced. Ethiopian economy inflation is being influenced by both the monetary and the structural factors. You can also justify for the short run. What determines the short run inflation in Ethiopia? Still, the money supply, real GDP, the spending of the government, real interest rate, all have an impact, an implication on the short run inflation. As a result, you see that both in the short run and in the long run, the Ethiopian inflation is being sourced from both monetary and the structural factors or shocks to the real sectors. Therefore, the conclusion based on these empirical evidence is that one, in general, in the long run, I hope you know what long run and short run mean, right? this refers to adjustment, right? In the long run, inflation in Ethiopia is sourced from both monetary phenomenon and from the structural factors. The monetary phenomenon might be, for instance, money supply. This money supply has an implication on credit expansion. In the same fashion, government expenditure has also an implication on inflation. As a result, it's possible to conclude that both the monetary phenomena and the structural factors are the source of inflation in Ethiopia. Structural factors ለምሳሌ በሪል ሴክተሩ ያሉ ሾኮች በጂዲፒ ለምሳሌ በምርታማነት ወይም ድሮት for instance ሊሆን ይችላል expenditures on construction therefore we can put the cause into both the structural factor and the monetary factors. I invite you to read this statement. I think someone has asked me yesterday about the inflation. Can we say that Ethiopian inflation is caused by a specific item or specific cause? Or can we single out the cause of inflation? The answer was no, right? Hence, inflation in Ethiopia is not explained by a single factor. We cannot explain the inflation by a single factor by either money growth or either real interest rate or exchange rate or government spending or real GDP. Rather, the inflation can be justified with the combination of all these factors. And the researchers as well has brought about the magnitude of the error correction coefficient. And it tells that it took at least a year to come back to the long run equilibrium. This is the end of the session. If you have a question, you are welcome. Otherwise, this is the end of the session for today. ጥያቄ ካላችሁ ማንሳት ትችላላችሁ። We have no this material. Please, can you send us? Definitely, I can send you contact site. ለሳይድ ልክላታለሁ። ሳይድ ደግሞ ለእናንተ ይልክላችኋል። Therefore, ተረፈ sure I can send you. አሁን ይሄ ለመመረቂያ ወረቀትም በዚህ ዙሪያ የምትሰሩ ካላችሁ የመጀመሪያውን I don't know ኢኮኖሜትሪክስ ትወሰዱ አላወኩም። ሳትወስዱ ከሆነ more of meaningless ሊሆን ይችላል ዲስከስ ያደረግነው። ምክንያቱም ፋክተሮች እንዴት አይዴንቲፋይ ይደረጋሉ እንዴት ኤስቲሜት ይደረጋል የሚለውን ቴክኒካሊቲስ ስላሉት ማለት ነው። Daniel has asked me what to mean structural factors. structural factors are factors other than the non-monetary component. For instance, from the dimension of the real sectors, specifically GDP, might be influenced by different factors, such as growth, right? ከሞኔታሪ ፋክተርስ ውጭ ያሉትን ከመኒ ሳፕላይ ከኤክስቼንጅ ሬት ከዛ ውጭ ያሉት ስትራክቸራል ፋክተርስ እንልናቸው እንችላለን። በተለይም ከጂዲፒ ጋር የተያያዙ ነገሮች ቀደም ላይ ሜንሽን ያደረግናቸው እነሱን በተለያየ መልክ ኢንፍሉዌንስ ሊያደርጉ ይችላሉ በጂዲፒ። ለምሳሌ real GDP is a component of the structural factor, and there might be a shock which affects these real sectors. ስለዚህ structural factor የሚሉት ሾኮችን ሁሉ ኮንሲደር የሚያደርገው real sectors and real GDP ሞኔታሪ ሴክተሩን ሳይሆን ማለት ነው።
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጉታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።